Hey everyone, Mr. Jeffersonian here, and if you haven't heard about Anchor, let me explain. It's the easiest way to make a podcast. First off, it's free, and who doesn't like that? There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer, and Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. So the call to action is download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Howdy everyone, and thank you again for tuning in to the Jeffersonian Tradition. Before we get started, I have a couple of things to go over. For now, the podcast is mostly ad-free, and I sure would like to keep it that way. You can help me out with that by becoming a supporting listener. If you find value in the podcast, there's a link in the show notes page that will enable you to contribute to my work and to help keep the podcast going and keep it light on advertising. Contributions start as low as 99 cents per month, with two other brackets at $4.99 per month or $9.99 per month. If you're not comfortable with a recurring contribution model, I've also set up a Cash App profile for the show. One-time contributions can be sent through Cash App to the show's cash tag, which is $ Mr. Jeffersonian, and all of this information will be listed in the show notes page as well. Any contribution amounts help, and thank you in advance to anyone who chooses to pitch in. And if you like the show, then please be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for it. We are now available on all major podcast platforms. And to help the show grow, make sure to share it with your friends and family. In other show-related news, if there's a topic you'd like for me to cover, or if you just have general questions for me, I can be contacted at the show's email address, which is mrjeffersonian@outlook.com, or through the show's MeWe group, which is also titled The Jeffersonian Tradition. And if you're not on MeWe yet, then seriously, what are you waiting for? Unlike a certain other social media platform, MeWe respects the right to free speech and offers a privacy bill of rights. So if you'd like to be a member there, then download the MeWe app and search for me at the username Mr. Jeffersonian. The show group is private, so we must be contacts before I can send you the group invite. If you're not familiar with MeWe's platform, contacts are the same as being friends on Facebook. With all of that fun stuff out of the way, let's now turn our attention to the topic for today's episode. So today is going to be the second episode in our trilogy of trains. And just real quick, I'm going to do a recap of the previous episode, so first episode of this trilogy. So on that first episode, we discussed the Credit Mobilier scandal and how the Union Pacific was able to fraudulently make over $94 million from the government. I also gave the audience some questions to think over, and real quick, I want to provide my takeaways from those questions to see how my thoughts compare to yours. So the first question was Oaks Ames an honest man corrupted by the mega project? Personally, I don't think so. Considering his wartime profiteering during the War for Southern Independence, I think Ames was a shady politician looking to make his millions at the public's expense however he could. If that meant untold suffering and death during the war, well, so be it, as long as he makes his millions. And if it meant using bribery and fraud to profit off of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, clearly he was willing to do that too. The second question was, should the general government have been involved in the financing of the Transcontinental Railroad at all? From my perspective, absolutely not. The libertarian in me says that no level of government should have been involved here. Considering the dearth of population in the vast landmass of the country at that time, it made no economic sense whatsoever to build that route. And the subsequent scandal shows that government officials were all too happy to milk it for all it was worth. Now, my Jeffersonian side says that the individual states along the route should have been consulted, and they could have decided whether or not to offer state financing, subsidies, land grants, so on and so forth. But I still think it would have been a bad idea for them to do so. In either case, a lack of involvement from the general government could have potentially forestalled the terribly tragic subjugation of the Western Indian tribes through force of arms. The Transcontinental also played a huge role in the near extermination of the American bison. And at some point, we're going to look at the Indian Wars and the despicable actions of Sherman and Sheridan in the westward expansion of the United States. And then the last question was, without outright government ownership of the rails and construction, how could that scandal have been prevented? Well, if it had been left completely to private investment, I believe the train would have eventually been built, just not by 1869. With the work being privately financed, there would have been severe consequences for fraud or malfeasance, which would have spurred the board of directors to be cost-conscious in order to show viable prospects of profitability once the train went into operation. Government tariffs on foreign steel also did not help matters, so I believe if the train had been a completely private endeavor, there would have been a lot of pressure to lower or eliminate the tariff so that the raw materials could be purchased at a much cheaper price, which would have had the effect of attracting more private capital, considering the cost-to-benefit analysis wouldn't have been so prohibitory. And so today we're going to move forward and we're going to study some modern examples of boondoggles when it comes to specifically high-speed passenger rail. And primarily, we're going to focus on the California train to nowhere. So if you're a California resident, you are probably all too familiar with what I'm talking about. But everybody else, go ahead, buckle up. This is going to be a little bit longer episode. And we're going to take a look at a complete failure of public policy in the state of California. All right, so in 2008, California voters were presented with Proposition 1A, which was a ballot initiative for high-speed rail that would run back and forth from San Francisco to Los Angeles. The act was officially titled Safe, Reliable, High-Speed Passenger Train Bond Act. This dream train would surpass true high-speed rail qualification by running at a minimum average speed of 200 miles per hour and would be able to make its commute in 2 hours and 40 minutes. And just for clarity, to be considered high-speed, trains must be able to run at sustained speeds of at least 155 miles per hour. Voters were told that all they had to do to achieve this dream was approve a $9.95 billion general obligation bond offering, which was the Proposition 1A, and that would include $9 billion for the planning and construction of the line. The state also told the citizens of California that the remaining funding would come from federal loans and grants as well as private investors, and that the line would be fully operational by 2020. The total price tag presented to the voters in this 2008 proposal was $33 billion. The measure was approved by a relatively small margin, 52.62% in favor and 47.38% against. And then created as a state agency in 1996, the California High-Speed Rail Authority, hereafter referred to as CHSRA, would be responsible for allocating the funds and granting the contracts to bring this train into existence. Now, it did not take long for problems to arise. But, just real quick as an aside, like its predecessors, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, the California train to nowhere also turned into a massive land grab, as the planned route was going to cut, in some cases, right through people's front yards or backyards. And the state is trying to use eminent domain, but have run into massive lawsuits from property owners trying to prevent the train and the state from taking their land. And that's actually pretty sad. If y'all want to look further on this, there is some pretty old ancestral farmland that's being taken. People's houses, in some cases, are being taken. It's kind of a sad ordeal what the state's doing to them. But thankfully, there are a lot of lawsuits in place. So hopefully, at the very least, hopefully maybe it'll bankrupt the state. Who knows? But yeah, definitely something to check out there in terms of what California is doing with eminent domain on this train. Now, it turns out that state planners had ignored opposition groups who pointed out that the actual cost of the line would be closer to $80 billion back in 2008. So by 2011, the opposition groups were actually vindicated when the CHSRA reported that its expected cost had ballooned to $98.5 billion with a B dollars. And the completion date was pushed back from 2020 to at the earliest 2033. 13 years later than the promised date in Proposition 1A. The air quote oversight here was that the state was planning on receiving a minimum of $17 billion in funding from the general government and then having the rest made up through private capital. And here I just have to go on a small rant. What insane levels of privilege does it take for people in California, especially the coastal elite, to expect the other 49 states to help them fund a transportation mega project that will only ever benefit citizens and tourists of the state of California. This is a prime example of why Jeffersonians rejected the idea of federally funded internal improvements way back in the day, back in the 1800s. Certain states would be enriched on the backs of the other states, and that is not right. If a state wants to take on a challenge such as this, then they need to be upfront about the cost with their citizens and tax them accordingly. And here is where we can have a discussion. We can have the libertarian versus Jeffersonian debate. From a libertarian standpoint, no level of government should be involved in granting corporate monopolies and stealing money from people to pay for a pork barrel project that only benefits a relatively few. But from a Jeffersonian standpoint, there could be an argument in favor of the project being a net public good, provided the work was done with the strictest economy of resources and manpower, so long as the state government is honest in the cost expectations. And so, Jeffersonians by and large did not believe in the concept of federally funded internal improvements, specifically because of crap like this. You would have states, in some cases very wealthy states, stealing money from the federal treasury to basically further enrich themselves, again, at the expense of those poorer states. So this is not a good thing. And again, just what world are we living in where Californians would think that's okay, that, yeah, everybody else in the other 49 states should help us out here. So rant over there, but just keep that in mind moving forward in this episode. Now, in light of the soaring cost in 2011, CHSRA's public relations team resigned that summer, and at this point, CHSRA had spent over $250 million before laying a single mile of track. Their fallback was to point at the yes vote of Proposition 1A as a mandate from the public to keep this sham going. And this failure happened despite the Obama administration providing $3.5 billion in federal grants to the CHSRA from 2010 to 2011. And then the hits just keep coming. So that was 2011. Now we're going to go to 2012. In its 2012 business plan report to the state, CHSRA revealed it could not meet the obligation to be a true high-speed train since it was going to be using a blended rail system. And not to get too far into the weeds here, but high-speed rail requires certain track requirements to be able to safely maintain those higher speeds. And again, for a train to be considered high-speed, it must be able to travel at an average sustained speed of at least 155 miles per hour. And this train's not going to be able to do that. So because it's going to be slower, its anticipated commute time is also going to be longer. So, they were very dishonest in how they presented this to the California voters. And in 2013, Judge Michael P. Kinney of the Sacramento Superior Court ruled in multiple lawsuits that the CHSRA did not follow requirements found in provisions of Proposition 1A. The judge prohibited the state from spending $8 billion in bonds until the requirements were met, including identifying $25 billion in additional funds. And so this is where the state lied to the citizens. They glossed over or looked at these projections through the rosiest of rose-colored glasses. And long story short, the private capital did not materialize. The federal funding did not materialize as quickly as what they needed it to. And so this thing was just dead on arrival, basically. However, the CHSRA had spent hundreds of millions of dollars through private contracting companies without ever getting any benefit. So no track had been laid at this point. And again, this is all the way in 2013, so 5 years after it was approved. So next in this horrible saga, the CHSRA finally breaks ground on this boondoggle on January 6, 2015, almost 7 years after getting the vote after the vote was approved for this train. Along the way, lawsuits from impacted property owners have multiplied, and private investors began to flee, starving the project of the private capital, again, that the state government assured voters would be there. So we can see this thing was just turning into a disaster. 7 years in, we're just now, 6.5 years in, we're just now breaking ground, and it's horrible. I mean, it is absolutely horrible, and the thought process is they only broke ground so they could say, well, look, we've already spent all this money and now we have a little bit of the train under construction, so it would be stupid to turn back now. That's the only reason that the state decided to go ahead and proceed here, is because they want to keep wasting the money. They want to keep the corruption going. Now, in 2017, Quentin Kopp gave an interview with Reason stating that he is suing to stop the train. Now, this is interesting because Quentin Kopp was actually the champion of Proposition 1A, and he exerted a lot of political influence to sell the public on the concept of this high-speed rail project. But after seeing the disaster unfold, Kopp had the integrity, and he was quoted in this interview stating, quote, "It is foolish and it is almost a crime to sell bonds and encumber the taxpayers of California at a time when this is no longer high-speed rail. And the litigation which is pending will result, I am confident, in the termination of the high-speed rail authority's deceiving plan," end quote. Unfortunately, thus far, construction does still continue even into 2021. Now, despite his faults, on February 12, 2019, Gavin Newsom made a bold statement regarding the project, stating, quote, "The project, as currently planned, would cost too much and take too long. There's been too little oversight and not enough transparency. Right now, there simply isn't a path to get from Sacramento to San Diego, let alone from San Francisco to LA. I wish there were," end quote. Newsom went on to say that the project would be curtailed to only run from Bakersfield to Merced, a distance of only 164 miles. That is a far, far cry from the 520-mile line that was approved by the voters in 2008. And so there's a lot of controversy here because that particular stretch of the highway in California, it's estimated that this train will never be able to carry more than 5% of the traffic for multiple reasons, but primarily because the first phase that's being done, that Bakersfield to Merced line, that's an empty stretch of highway for the most part. Even during peak time when the train was allegedly going to see its highest number of ridership or highest proportion of ridership, that is a dead stretch of highway. So just think of all the billions of dollars at this point that have just been literally thrown down the drain. That could have went to affordable housing. That could have went to improving the school system. That could have gone to improving the quality of medical care. That could have been spent so many other ways. It could have just been sent back to the taxpayers of California, too. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But just think of the horrible fraud, waste, and abuse that we have seen with this. In response to Newsom admitting defeat, on the very next day, Donald Trump demanded that California return the federal grant of $3.5 billion that Obama had approved. And say what you want about Trump, he was a pretty hilarious troll on the internet. But so he gets on there and starts antagonizing Gavin Newsom about this failure. And in a tweet, Trump said, quote, "California has been forced to cancel the massive bullet train project after having spent and wasted many billions of dollars. They owe the federal government $3.5 billion. We want that money back now. The whole project is a green disaster," end quote. California refused to comply, so on February 19th of 2019, the U.S. Department of Transportation announced that $929 million in federal grants to California were canceled. Unfortunately, the Biden administration reinstated this grant in June of 2021. So Biden, unfortunately, did go in there and bail him out. Now, today, construction is still bumbling along between Bakersfield and Merced, and the cost estimate has now ballooned to $100 billion. And again, estimates from experts on ridership project that the train, even if completed in its entirety, will never carry more than 5% of the traffic between San Francisco and LA. And that during peak traffic time, the train will most likely be almost empty because that stretch of highway again is dead and the commute would be too long for residents of one city to consider working in the other. And then if you consider the ongoing maintenance and capital improvement cost over the life of this train, that does quite literally mean it can never break even, let alone become profitable. So California taxpayers are perpetually going to be financial slaves to this line, or at the very least until it implodes. If we have a currency collapse or anything of that nature, then maybe they'll get some sort of relief just because it cannot sustain itself anymore. But this line, it can never be profitable because it's not going to have the ridership. And to the extent that maybe one day in the future it can, we're going to have to completely transform the way people think about transportation. America is not a train-based society like certain areas of Japan, certain parts of Europe. We are very much so an automobile-based society or flights. And so it would take decades, and we are, well, excuse me, not we, but California is literally stealing from the unborn with this measure and will be doing so in perpetuity again until we see some sort of financial implosion. And just of note, 36 counties in California voted against this disastrous train to nowhere. However, 20 voted in favor, and those were the populous counties mostly along the coast. And that's where the train would have ran and would have had any sort of benefit. So this begs the question, should the western coastal area of the state be able to raid the coffers of the rest of the state to pay for this pet project? I don't think so. And we have a group member of this show. Her name is Crystal Methodist. She's actually putting together an effort to stop crap like this from happening in the future. So she's putting together what she's calling a one county, one vote project. And what that would do is essentially create a state-level electoral college. And so in this case, the train would have had to have been approved by a majority of the counties, not just a majority of the California population at large. So there would have been some built-in protection to keep this disaster from happening. So definitely check out One County, One Vote when you have a chance. Definitely a very worthwhile project. So again, that's one way that we can return to some sort of semblance of government by the consent of the governed. We don't need to rely on the sacred majority, and I say that sarcastically. We need to look at having true majorities, so majority of counties, showing that it would be a benefit to most of the state. Now, we're going to kind of from here shift gears a little bit and look at some other examples of corruption with high-speed rail projects recently. In 2004, in Boulder, Colorado, voters approved the Fast Tracks proposal, which was supposed to enable Colorado's Regional Transportation District to construct a new high-speed rail line from Boulder to Denver. To date, Boulder residents have paid over $250 million in taxes, and not a single mile of that track has been completed. There's some controversy there because Denver is actually, it's speculated, has used some of that money to just expand its rail service in the downtown metro area. But to date, that particular line of track, nothing has been done. Again, over $250 million in taxes paid by the residents of Boulder. Now, that line was supposed to go into operation in 2016, but recently RTD announced that there is no possible way the line could be operational at any point prior to 2050. So imagine that. A tax approved in 2004, and now they're saying that there's no way it would be operational any sooner than 46 years after the tax was passed. That is not fair to the future citizens of this state, of those counties. That is not fair. They are going to be taxed for something they had absolutely zero say in. Now, in February of this year, RTD Denver board member Chantel Lewis even had the disgusting audacity to say, quote, "While I empathize with folks who believe they were promised something and never delivered, it doesn't feel good, I imagine. I am most concerned about those marginalized and vulnerable and those that rely on transit, not those that simply want what others have," end quote. And this was in response to a mandate from Colorado's governor that RTD must put more emphasis on completing this voter-approved line. But Lewis makes it clear that in her eyes, it is morally just to drain from affluent areas to build up lower-income areas. Voter input and promises be damned. Stupidly enough, despite this sham, Colorado's wonderful governor is now supporting a massive high-speed rail line that runs along the entire north-south I-25 corridor of Colorado. It's the Front Range High-Speed Rail Project, I believe is what they're calling that. So if y'all want to look into that, I actually don't believe he's that stupid, so I have to believe it's that he is that corrupt. But our governor was a citizen of Boulder when this first tax got passed, saw the disaster that unfolded there, and yet somehow he still is supporting this to build up through the entire north-south corridor of the state. It's ridiculous. And then another example is in 2005, a high-speed rail project for 20 miles of elevated track was proposed to connect downtown Honolulu to a lightly populated area in Kapolei, and this is in Hawaii, obviously. The reported cost estimate given to voters was $3.3 billion. That has since more than tripled to over $11 billion, and it is still not operational. In the United Kingdom, High Speed 2 was approved back in 2010 for a price tag of between £30.9 billion to £36 billion. This line is supposed to run from London up to Manchester with another offshoot that runs to Leeds. Construction did not begin until late 2020 and is not projected to be completed until sometime between 2035 to 2040. As of the end of 2020, the cost for that project had skyrocketed to as much as £170 billion, again up from 30.9 to 36 billion. And the conservative estimate is that it could be 98 billion pounds. But again, I personally kind of tend to skew more towards the higher numbers just because of every example that we have. And then the last international example that we have is Spain's nationalized AVE high-speed train, and it's been running for about 30 years now and has received billions of euros from the EU, along with untold billions from Spanish taxpayers. And this line remains one of the lightest used high-speed rail networks in the world, only hauling approximately 15,500 passengers per rail mile as of a 2017 report. That's actually the latest report I could find. If anybody else can find a more recent one, I would actually appreciate that. Now, AVE's financial reports keep going further into the red, with the train losing hundreds of millions of euros per year. And not even the line connecting Madrid and Barcelona is remotely close to breaking even. Despite this cold hard economic fact, Spain is continuing to dump billions into constructing new expansions of the line that will have even less ridership and therefore will be an ever-increasing drain on the country's economy. And so, again, this is coming from somebody, I like the concept of trains. I do. I really and truly do. But the more I dug into this, the conditions just have to be so perfect. It is not feasible. It's just not feasible. And it becomes a huge drain on the economy at large. Now, the conclusion that I reached from researching this episode is that the government, either through incompetence or corruption, cannot be trusted with any rail project. Costs always seem to skyrocket beyond what they present to voters, and the time frame for completion means that the people who approved it most likely won't be around to see it, and they also won't be stuck with the financial burden of paying the taxes for their bad decisions. It's wrong to steal money from future generations for so-called public investments that can literally never break even. For these projects to be worth the endeavor, the conditions must be so perfect as to almost be unrealistic. And this is proven by the fact that as of to date, there are only two profitable high-speed rail lines in the world: the Japanese Tokyo to Osaka route and the French Paris to Lyon route. Therefore, despite my personal love of trains, I have to say that they should never be taken on as a public project. If a private company wants to take them on, that's fine. They should never be taken on as a public project. So we're going to go ahead and stop it here for today. Next week, we are going to look at a couple of companies who are trying to go the private route to finance some high-speed rail projects and see the difference. And be sure to tune in next episode when we take a look at that. Please remember, if you found value in the podcast, to consider contributing to the show. You can contribute on a recurring basis through the supporting listener link in the show notes page, or you can make a one-time contribution by using the show's Cash App information, which is also included in that show notes page. Any contribution amount helps, and thank you again to everyone in advance who decides to do so. Also, please consider downloading the MeWe app and joining the show's private group so we can have more sane discussion around historical and current political issues. And all right, with another episode in the books, thank you again for tuning in, and I'll talk to y'all next time.